I remember the morning clearly, though it was over a century ago, a frigid December day in 1917, when the frost clung to every surface and the sky above Moscow hung low and pale as if holding its breath for what was to come. And in that brittle silence I signed a decree that would set in motion something vast and terrible, something that would in time seep into every crevice of Soviet life and carve itself into the bones of history itself. That morning I established the Cheka, the first Soviet state security organization, and I placed it under the iron grip of a man aptly nicknamed Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky, who from within the stark and unyielding walls of the Lubyanka building in the heart of the capital would orchestrate a campaign of surveillance and retribution that would come to define the machinery of our power. It seemed at the time no more than a necessary step, a bureaucratic act of revolution, one of many forged in the heat of civil war and ideological chaos. But even I could not have foreseen how this particular order would become the foundation stone of a vast and unrelenting architecture of punishment and repression, an apparatus that would stretch its fingers across the entirety of the Soviet Union, from the icy edges of the White Sea to the sunless barrens of Kolyma, a network so immense and consuming that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, one of its survivors, would later call it an archipelago not of islands in the ocean, but of labor camps scattered across the continent, invisible on maps yet etched into the memories of millions. We called it the Gulag, an acronym, a technical-sounding term that concealed the horror it would come to represent, the main administration of camps. And though the full enormity of the system would not come into being until the years of Stalin's unchallenged rule, its roots were undeniably mine. For I, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, in the tumultuous birth of our new world, believed that forced labor was not only a practical necessity for rebuilding a shattered nation, but also an ideological crucible in which the old bourgeois elements, the enemies of the working class, might be broken down and reforged, or simply broken. In the fevered spring of 1918, when counter-revolution threatened from every side and the economy teetered on the edge of collapse, I wrote without hesitation that we must cleanse Russia for a long time to come, and I authorized the creation of the first concentration camps for what we deemed unreliable elements, those whose loyalties were suspect, whose pasts were tainted by privilege or opposition, or whose silence we could not trust. I remember the telegram I sent to Penza that August, when rumors of rebellion flickered like fire along the Gulag's edge. Hang without fail, no fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men parasites, so that the people see and tremble. These camps, crude at first, were born during the period we called the Red Terror, and their initial purpose was clear. They were to house political enemies, officers of the old Tsarist regime, members of the bourgeoisie, and anyone who might in word or deed oppose the revolution's will. One of the earliest of these, the Kolmogorye camp near Arkhangelsk, became infamous for its killing efficiency, especially in 1921, when hundreds of officers from Admiral Kolchak's defeated White Army were rounded up, marched in silence, and executed in the snow. I do not delude myself now, nor will I offer the excuses I once gave freely. These camps were not transitional measures, not temporary answers to momentary crises. They became, in short order, permanent fixtures of our governance tools, as indispensable as the commissariat or the factory. And though Stalin would later industrialize the system and multiply its scale 1,000-fold, even our early efforts bore the marks of brutality and control. We converted a former monastery on the Solovetsky Islands, far out in the frozen White Sea, into a prison that would come to serve as the blueprint for what was to follow. At Solovki, the thick stone cells once home to chanting monks were packed with dozens of prisoners, enemies of the people, intellectuals, dissidents, peasants, who had dared to resist grain requisition. Dmitry Likachev, a man who would later rise to be one of Russia's most revered cultural historians, lived among them and remembered the biting cold, the desperate quiet, the eerie beauty of the place where escape was not even a fantasy. There we first tested the economic potential of forced labor. There we discovered how profitable desperation could be when it was paired with isolation and threat. The camp's commander, Naftali Frenkel, proved himself a visionary in cruelty. It was he who introduced the rationing system that would become a grim standard throughout the Gulag food portions, tied not to need or fairness, but to output those who worked the hardest, regardless of injury, age, or strength, received the most bread and gruel while the weak were left to fade away. It was a perfect mechanism, elegant in its savagery, one that created a hierarchy of suffering and ensured that the specter of starvation stalked every laborer's steps. And so it began. What had started as a handful of makeshift prisons evolved within a few years into an embryonic empire of labor punishment and ideology. Each camp was a seed of the great structure to come, and the men who administered them, men like Frenkel and Berzin, were not mere wardens, but architects of a new Soviet reality, one in which survival itself became a test of political fitness. We knew even then that the Gulag was more than a system of control. It was a forge for the creation sought of the new Soviet citizen, one who would fear us, yes, but also serve us, and in that terror and obedience find their place in our vision of the future. As I look back now, I see not only the practical horror of those years, the beatings, the frostbite, the starvation, but the ideological zeal with which we embraced them, believing that from this crucible of pain, we would extract a new order, one purified of its enemies, one strengthened by sacrifice. I believed it then, even as I signed the papers, heard the reports, read the death tallies, and imagined that all this could be justified in the name of revolution. But the cold truth is this: we built a system whose foundations were corpses and whose mortar was human misery. And it all began with a signature on a cold December morning in a city that was still dreaming of utopia. They called us kulaks, wealthy peasants, enemies of the working class, stubborn clumps of resistance buried deep in the fertile soil of the Soviet countryside. And one by one, and then by the millions, we were uprooted, denounced, stripped of our homes and land, and hurled into the machinery of state vengeance, not for what we had done, but for what we represented, until we were no longer individuals with families, names, or memories, but a category to be liquidated, a class erased by decree. I remember the moment it became clear that we were not to be reformed, but removed. There was no trial, no hearing, only the thunder of boots at the door, and the blank faces of local officials who listed our belongings with bureaucratic detachment before seizing the grain, the livestock, the very seeds we had saved for spring, and then with rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, they ordered us to prepare for transport, as if one could pack for oblivion. They took us to a place I had never heard of and never forgot, Nazino, a swampy island in the Ob River, where the mosquitoes outnumbered the trees and the sky never promised mercy. We were 6,000 strong when we arrived, crowded onto barges like sacks of spoiled wheat, shivering in the cold, already hungry, already afraid. And when the barges pulled away and left us there with little more than flour and the bones in our bodies, we understood the truth too late. We had not been exiled to live, but abandoned to die. By the time the authorities returned weeks later, over 4,000 of us were gone, lost to dysentery, cold, exposure, madness. And among the survivors, the stories passed in whispers, then screams of men, hunted like animals, of flesh torn from the dead and boiled over, driftwood fires of women who traded themselves for a crust of bread or a few handfuls of raw flour, until we no longer looked at each other as people, but as potential threats or worse, food. One of us, an old farmer from Ukraine, spoke only once after the rescue, and what he said still haunts me. They took everything, our grain, our animals, even the seeds for next year's planting. Then they took us. And with those words, he curled into silence forever. But Nazino was only one drop in the tidal wave of exile that followed. By 1941, nearly 1 million of us entire families, children born under the label of enemy old women, who had never seen a factory or a city, were living under armed guard in special settlements, scattered across the forested frontiers and the icy expanse of Siberia, building logging roads, digging ditches, raising crops. We would never eat all without walls or watchtowers, for the land itself was our prison, and the snow our sentry. And still it was not enough. For Stalin, suspicion became a doctrine, and from that doctrine sprang a policy of collective judgment so sweeping, so indifferent to humanity, that whole peoples were marked for punishment, their ethnicity alone enough to earn exile or death. I watched as freight trains packed with Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, and Volga Germans disappeared into the east. Their windows covered their destination, unstated, only to emerge days or weeks later in the vastness of Kazakhstan or Central Asia, where winter was the first to greet them, and many never survived the meeting. In February of 1944, I saw 500,000 Chechens and Ingush loaded into boxcars in the span of a few days, herded by soldiers as if they were cattle infected with disease, and when they arrived in the steppe, they found no shelter, no welcome, only hunger and cold. I remember hearing that 1/3 of them died within the first few months. But the death was not what chilled me, it was the forgetting. Their towns were erased, their cemeteries plowed under their names, stripped from maps and textbooks, so that even memory itself was made illegal. The Crimean Tatars, taken in May of that same year, fared no better. Almost half of their number perished before they could build new homes in exile. And though they whispered in their kitchens and prayed behind drawn curtains, it would be more than 40 years before they were allowed to return to their ancestral land, by then unrecognizable, renamed, repopulated. I often think that the Gulag was not only a place of confinement, but a way of thinking, a philosophy of power built on fear, suspicion, and the ritual humiliation of the weak. And nowhere was this more clear than in the treatment of those who had fought for the country only to be betrayed by it. After the Second World War, when the tide of victory had turned in our favor, and the Red Army had marched all the way to Berlin, our returning soldiers, those who had survived the horror of Nazi captivity, did not find gratitude waiting for them at home, but interrogation, accusation, and cold steel gates. For Stalin believed or claimed to believe that anyone who had fallen into enemy hands, even briefly, had been infected by capitalist corruption, and so he sent them not to their families, but to the camps. I met one such man, an officer who had defended Leningrad through the siege, had eaten rats to survive, had watched comrades freeze to death at their posts, only to be arrested upon liberation for words he had spoken in despair during the worst nights. Words someone had written down or maybe just invented. 10 years he spent in Kolyma cutting timber until his hands bled through his gloves, and when I asked him much later if he had ever understood why, he simply said, "Because I survived." General Andrei Vlasov, once hailed as a hero for defending Moscow, was captured by the Germans and later chose collaboration, perhaps out of desperation, perhaps conviction. It matters little now, but when the war ended, he and his men were returned to Moscow and executed in the Lubyanka's basement, the very place where our revolution had begun its descent into terror. And so by 1950, the Gulag stood at its apex, a sprawling shadow empire that swallowed up lives with mechanical indifference, its camps dotting the map like stars in a constellation of misery, its settlements stretching across a landmass larger than Western Europe, and within its iron bones moved 2.5 million souls stripped of names and identities, remade into numbers, quotas, and statistics. I had become a number 2-1, among many indistinguishable, except by the color of my uniform or the length of my sentence, and the state that had promised liberation had become a prison ward, obsessed not with efficiency, but with control. We were a state, within a state with our own roads, our own economy, even our own culture shaped by hunger and silence and frostbite. And if you asked any of us where we were, we would not name the camp, but the temperature -30, -40, -50, the numbers that ruled our days and decided who would live through the night. I remember Vigash Island far to the north, where we mined lead and zinc under the winter moon, and how the darkness never lifted, only deepened with time, and how every month a third of us failed to return from the worksite, our bodies buried in snow or forgotten entirely, for the quotas were more important than the people, and the guards were paid in bonuses for every ton extracted, every life extinguished quietly by exhaustion. Even then, as we stumbled through the ice and mud with pickaxes and frozen bread, we began to understand what some already knew, that the gulag did not exist to build, but to destroy, that it was not a flaw in the system, but its very foundation. There were rules of course provision standards, nutritional charts, medical quotas, all printed in neat columns and filed in government cabinets as proof that our system cared for its prisoners. But I lived the reality behind the paperwork, and I can tell you that those standards were rarely met, and even when they were, they arrived on our plates, half stolen, skimmed by the very administrators, entrusted with our survival, traded on black markets, for vodka cigarettes, or favors, or handed out like bribes to the informants, who watched us through half-closed eyes, and reported every whispered thought for a crust of extra bread. At Solovki, the place where it had all begun, the monastery turned. Prison turned model for an empire. I sometimes caught the scent of fresh vegetables and meat drifting from the administrative wing, where guards and commanders dined behind thick wooden doors. Their laughter muffled but constant, while we prisoners bent from cold, and hunger gnawed at moldy bread that crumbled like dust in our mouths, and swallowed bowls of soup so thin and gray, we called it dishwater with the memory of cabbage. By 6 in the morning, no matter the season, the bell would ring, or the guards would shout, or the doors would crash open, and the work brigades would assemble in silence, already exhausted, already hungry, already knowing that the day ahead would be long and punishing. And as we marched out of the barracks in staggered lines, the cold cut into our lungs like knives, and the snow beneath our boots whispered of death. At Vorkuta, where the coal mines lay buried beneath ice and grief, we walked 5 kilometers each way to the shafts, heads bowed against the Arctic wind, so fierce that ropes were strung between buildings, to keep men from being blown into the whiteness, and lost forever, their bodies found only when spring turned the snow to slush, and bones rose like memories from the mud. The work was not merely hard, it was deliberately exhausting, shaped to drain the body and dull the mind for, in the eyes of our keepers, the body was a tool to be used until it broke, and the mind a danger unless kept busy with suffering. In Kolyma, where the ground itself seemed to hate us, we chipped and hacked at permafrost with tools so crude they belonged to another century. And the quotas we were given, measures of output that bore no relation to human capacity, hung over us like death sentences, because if you failed to meet your number, you were punished, not with the whip, but with less food, and less food meant less strength, and less strength meant less work, and so the spiral tightened around your life like a noose. I remember Mikhail Rozanov, a geologist with eyes that had once studied rock formations with scientific precision, shaking his head in disbelief as he watched us dig with bent picks and broken shovels, muttering that no sane man would mine this way, unless insanity was the point. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps the point was never production, but punishment, never gold or coal, but obedience wrung from flesh. Even solidarity, that last refuge of the oppressed, began to fray beneath the weight of starvation. I saw men sabotage each other's tools so their own quotas would seem more impressive, or hoard the best shovels while others worked with splinters or whisper lies to guards just to be moved to an easier shift. At Ukta, among the oil fields where the air itself stank of chemicals and failure, those who couldn't meet the quotas, too old, too weak, too broken, were placed into the OKP, the weak brigade, a name that should have offered mercy, but instead meant the opposite: rations cut in half assignments in the most dangerous zones, and the slow certainty that death would come not as punishment, but as policy. True to dawn workday units, they called them a metric that reduced your body's output into a number on a ledger, and that number fed you. The more you produced, the more you ate. But that simple equation turned cruel when your muscles gave out and your fingers split in the cold, because then the number dropped, and so did your bread, and so did your chances of seeing another sunrise. 10 hours we were told to labor, but that was a fiction. 10 hours was the time you spent working, once you arrived at the site. But it did not include the hours spent marching to and from the site, or the hours standing in the cold, waiting for tools to be distributed, or the hours wasted in confusion when quotas were changed mid-shift. And in truth, the day never ended until darkness fell, and sometimes not even then. At Bellamore, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, the slogan said, "We were building a better tomorrow," but the canal was shallow, narrow, useless, built not for boats, but for parades and propaganda. And we who carved it out with shovels and hands knew that we were not laborers, but sacrifices. More than 25,000 of us died there, not because the task was impossible, though it nearly was, but because the system demanded corpses to sanctify its progress. I remember the chalk. The guards would write our quotas on our backs each morning, a number scrawled in white across the coarse fabric of our uniforms. And if that number was not met by sunset, you were not permitted to return, not permitted to eat, not permitted to rest. Gustav Herling, a Polish prisoner I met once by chance, told me that during the Arctic summer, when the sun never set, the guards would declare that the day had not ended, and so neither could the work. At Ozalag near Lake Baikal, we learned that the official 10-hour shift was only the core of the torment, not its boundaries. We marched for hours in darkness to reach our work sites. We waited for broken equipment. We argued over shattered picks and missing rations, and only then did the shift begin. And if a man collapsed before the clock released him, he was dragged to the side, wrapped in silence, and left for the others to pass. Weather. Weather was a joke. Work was supposed to stop at -41 degrees Celsius, but quotas did not pause for frost, and so the thermometers were hidden or tampered with, or simply ignored. And I worked many days when the air was so cold it felt like fire in my throat, when my breath froze to my collar, and the snow beneath my feet creaked like bones. In Magadan, a place where hope went to die, we said there were only 2 seasons, winter and July, and sometimes July never came. And yet, even after the day was done, the punishment continued. The barracks were not shelters, but cages overcrowded beyond reason, filled with stink and noise and bodies packed so tightly that sleeping meant lying atop another man's breath. In Magadan's transit camp, the women said they slept in shifts, not because of regulations, but because there was simply not enough floor to hold them all at once. At Kolaima's Butugachog mine, where we clawed uranium from the earth with bare hands, the barracks were crammed so tightly that frost formed on the inside walls, even as we slept shoulder to shoulder, and every inhale carried the dust of the day's digging. The whispers of the dying, the groans of teeth grinding in dreams of bread. Mattresses were a fantasy, planks were reality. And if you had a sack to stuff with straw, you guarded it like a child, for even a fragment of cloth could mean the difference between frostbite and sleep. I learned to sleep sitting up. I learned to ignore lice crawling beneath my collar. I learned that in the gulag, mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. You could lose everything in a moment sometimes for speaking too freely, sometimes for holding on too tightly, but most often for no reason at all. Because within the walls of the camp, even a pencil stub was considered contraband, and a prisoner found in possession of such a dangerous item might be dragged without warning into the kartze, the punishment cell where food was reduced to survival rations, and the cold became your only companion, your only enemy, your only certainty. I was there once, or maybe twice, it's hard to remember when the memories bleed together, and I can tell you that the kartze was not a room but a hole, a chamber cut into the earth or sunk into the permafrost, unheated, unswept, unkind. And if you were sent there during winter, the sentence might as well have been death. Not because the guards shot you, but because they simply left you exposed to air that refused to rise above freezing, sometimes even in summer, and they knew what that air would do. At Vorkuta, they called it the black hole, and I remember being lowered down into it, the light fading the ice slick on the walls, and then the lid closing above me like the final page of a forgotten book. Eugenia Ginsberg, who survived more years than any soul should have, to once described how a woman at Elgin camp endured 9 days in the kartze, refusing to sit, refusing to sleep, refusing to let the frost take her. She moved constantly, every muscle burning with desperation, and by some miracle of will or madness, she came out alive. Her toes blackened, her spirit intact. But most did not. Most of us, when placed there, succumbed not to frostbite, though it came swiftly, nor even to hunger, though that lingered longer than pain, but to the silence, an all-consuming, cavernous silence that devoured thought and memory until we no longer knew what we had said or done or were. Malnutrition had become a condition we wore like a second skin clinging to bones that jutted out like tools, and overwork had eaten away at our joints, our breath, our strength. Disease found us weakened and made quick work of our bodies, while the constant psychological torment of never knowing when the rules would change, of being punished for things we had never been told were crimes, of watching those around us vanish in the night, sank into our thoughts like poison. The numbers tell only part of the truth, but even those are staggering in 1932 and 1933 during the worst of the famine, and again in the early years of the war from 1941 to 1943, the death rates in some camps rose above 25% annually, which meant that every fourth man you saw on a Monday morning would be dead by the next season. At Karlog, where the wind never stopped and the landscape itself seemed angry, a third of the camp perished in 1933 alone. And at the coal mines of Vorkuta, during the terrible winters of the early 1940s, it was said that 28,000 of us died in less than 2 years, our bodies stacked or burned or buried shallowly, too many for ceremony, too many for grief. After the war, as the system hardened and specialized new camps emerged, Ozalag Steplag built not for criminals or the desperate, but for those labeled especially dangerous political offenders, and the euphemism barely concealed its intent. For these were camps designed to erase us slowly, invisibly, efficiently, targeting the mind, the body, the very notion of resistance. Beria, the one who wore silk while signing death warrants, and whose name alone was enough to silence a room, had once calculated that an acceptable mortality rate in these camps was 5% per month, and whether that number was met or exceeded, I never knew. But I do know what it looked like to watch entire brigades vanish in Kolyma at the Dniprovsky mine, where the corpses could not be buried, because the ground was stone and ice, so instead, they were stacked like timber outside the barracks, lined up like warnings, their eyes frozen open. And the records. The precious Soviet records, once sealed and sacred, eventually betrayed the truth that we always knew. Officially documented deaths, though we suspected many more, because some died just after release, some died in exile, and some were never counted at all. Oleg Klevnyuk, a historian with access we could never have dreamed of, found evidence that during those same war years in some transports, the mortality rate among new arrivals exceeded 50%, which meant that the trains themselves were instruments of death. the journey just another corridor to the grave. But what I remember most clearly, more than the pain or the cold or the silence, was the look in people's eyes when they finally understood that they were not coming out, that no one was coming to help, that the world had moved on without them, that even their names might be forgotten, and how despite this, they still tried to leave something behind. Isaac Vogelfanger, who passed through more camps than any man should endure, once wrote that in the Gulag, we learned just how fragile the concept of humanity really was, but also that even in the worst conditions, there remained a spark that kept us from becoming animals, just a spark, but enough. At Magadan, a woman named Evrosinia Krasnovskaya, a prisoner like the rest of us, hid scraps of paper and bits of charcoal under her clothes and used them to draw, to sketch the life around her, the work sites, the faces, the suffering, and buried those drawings beneath the floorboards of the barracks. Years later, after she had somehow survived and returned, she dug them up and gave them to the world. They were dark, rough, scratched with pain and brilliance, and they remain among the most haunting records of the Gulag ever created. And it was because of her and others like her that I began to understand something important, that even when you are buried, even when you are silenced, even when the snow has covered your footsteps and the guards no longer remember your face, if you have left a mark, a story, a name scrawled on a tin cup or etched into a wall, then the system has not won. I would walk past those walls covered in graffiti scratched by frozen fingers and read the names like Lev, Tamara, Yakov, Galina, and realize that every letter was an act of defiance, a refusal to be erased. And so I scratched my name too, not because I expected to live, but because I wanted to be remembered. I had heard the crack of gunfire before I had watched men dragged away in the dead of night, their faces blank with resignation or twisted with final defiance, but nothing prepared me for the sound of a gun that was meant to kill, but fired only air, for the motionless terror of a blank execution was worse than a real one, because it made you live through your death and then keep living afterward. Your soul fractured, your body still breathing, but hollowed out like a tree struck by lightning. They pulled us from our barracks at night, never during daylight, always during the hours when the cold was deepest and the mind most vulnerable, and they marched us not quickly but slowly, out to the pits already dug, some freshly turned, others long filled, and made us kneel sometimes with our hands tied, sometimes clutching the earth as if it could save us, and they pointed their rifles and gave the orders and pulled the triggers, and when the click came instead of the bullet, or the sound of a blank echoed through the air, we gasped and shivered and waited to see if we would be sent back, or if this had only been the first rehearsal. Janusz Bardach survived such a night in Kolyma back in 1941, and he told me later that although his heart had continued to beat, he had died all the same, that some vital part of him had been left in that pit, buried with the silence that followed the shots. I believed him because I had seen it too, had seen men come back from those mock executions, with eyes that no longer blinked, with voices that no longer rose above whispers, as if even their breath had learned to be afraid. At Norilsk in 1938, Commander Kluknikov, a man whose name still makes me clench my fists, organized mass mock executions for up to 30 prisoners at a time, lining them up like cattle, forcing them to dig their own graves, then laughing as he fired blanks into the trembling rows, only to repeat the process days later until the difference between a real and false death lost meaning altogether. And the worst part, the part that still makes me tremble, was not the cruelty, though that was boundless, but the precision, the calculation, the knowledge that this was not madness, but method. During the Great Terror of 1937, such scenes became routine because terror itself had become the instrument of governance, and death was doled out as both punishment and performance. And we, the audience, learned our lessons well. Anna Akhmatova, whose son Lev was taken like so many others, once wrote that she had learned how faces fall apart, how fear stares out from beneath the lids, and I knew she was telling the truth because I had seen it every morning in the mirror, if mirrors were still allowed, and in the polished steel of the soup pot, if there was any light to catch a reflection. And yet, physical cruelty beatings, starvation. The cold was not the only weapon in the arsenal of the Gulag. There were more insidious tools, ones that reached deeper, ones that burrowed into our thoughts and poisoned even the few moments of camaraderie we managed to preserve. They called them shtukachi inmates, who informed on others either for better food or shorter sentences, or simply because they had broken and would do anything to avoid the pain returning, and they were everywhere. You could not speak freely in the barracks, or in the line to the latrines, or even while dreaming aloud in your sleep, because someone might be listening, someone might be waiting to turn your words into currency. And it wasn't always the obvious ones, the swaggering favorites of the guards, but often the quietest, the ones who looked away during head counts, who mumbled their responses, who seemed like they had already given up. At Solovki, long before it became just another dot on the map of suffering, I learned that as many as 1 in 5 prisoners might be informing on their comrades, and that figure was not an exaggeration, but a policy encouraged from above and rewarded from below, a structure of betrayal that kept us fragmented and afraid. The cruelty of it was that it did not merely extract information, it destroyed the very idea of community, of solidarity, of shared pain. We were alone together. In our camp, we developed codes, strange abbreviations, half sentences, hand signals, ways of saying things that would mean nothing, if repeated ways of hiding meaning in nonsense. We called it Sheptalo whisper speech, and we used it not only to survive, but to retain something of ourselves, a spark of language that hadn't yet been stolen. But even this was dangerous, because if you were caught whispering, you could be accused of conspiracy, and the punishment was swift. I remember how one man was dragged from the line after muttering something under his breath, something so quiet, even I couldn't hear it, though I stood beside him, and how he never came back, and how no one dared ask where he had gone. That silence was another form of control, a rule we followed more faithfully than any law do not speak of, the vanished. Collective punishment ensured that we were made responsible for each other's failures, which meant that hatred flowed in every direction. If one man missed his quota, we all lost our food. If one woman tried to escape, her entire barracks stood for hours in the snow. At Norilsk in the late 1940s, I remember 3 days without bread after our unit failed to meet the production target. And on the second day, a fight broke out over a potato peel. And on the third day, someone was beaten to death for hoarding crumbs. I was there when Susanna Pechora told the story of Taishet camp, how after one woman escaped in 1952, all 600 women were made to stand outside for 18 hours in minus 30 degrees, and 27 of them died where they stood. She told it without tears, without inflection, as if it were a weather report, because by then that's what death had become, expected, predictable like the wind or the cold. And when we were told to punish each other, we did. Running the gauntlet was one of the worst, a line of prisoners forced to beat a fellow inmate as he ran past, and those who refused were made to take his place, or worse, punished twice for disobedience. At Vorkutlag, I saw a man's skin hang from his back like wet cloth after he was forced through what we called the corridor of death, 100 meters of fists, sticks, iron bars. At Kengir, it became theater shame as ritual violence as performance. And the worst of all was the circle of shame at Sevostlag, where we moved in circles and struck each other in rhythm under the eyes of guards who called it discipline but watched it like entertainment. Some laughed. Some took notes. That was the genius of the system, as Vladimir Bukovsky later said, not that it tortured us, but that it made us torture ourselves. I still remember, though, sometimes I wish I didn't, how cruelty within the Gulag didn't always come in sweeping state decrees or calculated bureaucratic procedures. It often wore a human face, leering and unpredictable like the face of that guard we came to call the butterfly. a name that belied the torment she devised, where she'd wedge cigarettes between our trembling fingers and smile as they burned down into our flesh, watching as if cataloging our pain in her mind, like some twisted collector of agony. And in that surreal space of controlled suffering, it became clear that the system didn't merely tolerate sadists. It recruited them, encouraged them, paid them, and offered them the bleakest of theaters in which to perform, where each scream and flinch was just another act in an endless performance of domination. The name Nikolai Garanin will never leave my mind, nor the macabre rituals he invented at Serpentinka, where death came so frequently and personally by his hand that we in whispered awe and horror called it Garanization, a word that meant executions didn't follow from procedure or law, but from whim, and as Shalamov wrote with the weary precision of a man who had seen too much. The Gulag didn't breed monsters so much as it handed uniforms and rifles to those already halfway down the road, to monstrosity offering them legitimacy, sanction, and victims by the thousands. When the whispers came faint, almost unbelievable, that Stalin was dead, and that his legacy, once wrapped in sanctity and fear, might be spoken of in tones other than reverence. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but in 1956, as I stood in a re-education meeting surrounded by faces as gaunt and skeptical as mine, we were told of a speech, a strange and almost mythic moment, when Nikita Khrushchev, not in public, not in the papers, but behind closed doors and locked halls, had stood before the 20th Congress and begun to undo with words that stung more than bullets the myth of Stalin dismantling brick by brick the monument we had been forced to build with our silence, our fear, and the bones of the dead. They say some wept openly as he spoke, that the room filled with gasps and the clatter of collapsing illusions. And though we were not there, not allowed near the place where that speech was given, its echoes reached us nonetheless. And for the first time in my years of captivity, I felt something like a crack in the foundation of the empire that had caged us. And yet, even as the truth spilled out in hushed tones, we knew instinctively that truth alone would not dismantle what had been so carefully constructed. Beria Stalin's secret police enforcer turned temporary reformer had already set the first stones in motion, issuing a sweeping amnesty in March 1953, though I didn't benefit from it, as it prioritized petty thieves and women with children and left people like me convicted of political sins, such as having opinions or relatives abroad, to wait and watch, unsure whether our turn would come or whether we would, like so many before us, simply vanish into the permafrost, with our rehabilitation papers forever lost in some misfiled drawer in Lubyanka. I remember the strange hope that Khrushchev's speech carried, even though it was never officially published, and how we clung to each detail smuggled out through samizdat, or overheard from a guard whose hands trembled slightly more than usual. How we learned he'd called out the grotesque lies of the doctor's plot, and how he'd dared to speak the names of men like Bukharin and Zinoviev, names we had once only heard in indictments or execution orders, now spoken with a measure of honor, as if their ghosts might finally rest. Between 1954 and 1957, commissions were dispatched to the outer reaches of the archipelago, to Vorkuta, Norilsk, Karlog, and places whose very names had come to mean suffering, where three-person panels, troikas again, but of a different kind, reviewed our files, asked us questions. Some of them even listened, and yet still they made decisions not based on fairness or justice, but on policy shifts and quotas, for even in reform, the Soviet system loved its quotas. I watched men break when their rehabilitation was denied, when they were told their suffering was either justified or insufficiently unjust, and I watched others walk out of the barbed wire gates, blinking like moles in sunlight, unsure how to rejoin a world that had forgotten them. And I wondered if I would be like them one day, or if I would simply become another ghost, pacing the perimeter, hoping for a name to be called that never would be. When I finally did leave, it wasn't with fanfare or apology, just a stamped form, a train ticket, and a hole where my trust used to be. The cities I returned to were unfamiliar. The streets renamed, the people hurried and distant. And when I tried to speak of what had happened, I saw in their eyes a fear that still lived. A fear that asked me silently to be quiet, to let it go, to move on. Solzhenitsyn, whose release came just before mine, captured it all in his words, and his staggering witness asserting in his Nobel lecture that one word of truth outweighs the whole world. And though I never wrote like he did, I carried my own truths, my own small flame of memory. Because if we let those words go, if we bury them like bones under the snow, then the machine can restart, and it will find new fuel. Shalamov, whom I once met in passing as two prisoners sharing a ration and a bitter joke about death, later described the Gulag not as a place of punishment, but of annihilation. And I believe him, for I too felt my identity erode day by day, not just from hunger or cold, but from the systematic way the camps erased your name, your voice, your past, leaving behind only a number and a pair of trembling hands holding a bowl of soup too thin to nourish the body or the soul. The dismantling of the Gulag was slow, and even as camps were shuttered and barracks burned for scrap, the legacy remained in the streets of cities built by prisoners, in the silence of families who never received a letter, in the nervous glances shared between former inmates and their watchers turned neighbors, and in the archives that, even when opened briefly, revealed horrors that statistics could never truly convey. By the time I stepped foot again on Moscow pavement, I felt as though I had crossed dimensions, not years, because the country that once exalted its executioners now professed shock at their deeds, and yet still promoted men who had signed orders with one hand and now signed reforms with the other. And I asked myself, can a system change its soul without ever confessing it had one? They gave us back our names, but not our time. And as I walked past buildings I once knew, now plastered with portraits of new leaders and slogans of progress, I felt less a citizen than a witness, one who had returned from the land of the unburied, still clutching names, memories, and the weight of too many unmarked graves. The brutal toll of my years within the Soviet Gulag was not simply measured in bloodied hands, frost-bitten feet, or the echo of guards' shouts ricocheting across icy barrack walls. It was measured in the unrelenting silence that crept into my bones each night, the kind of silence that followed a man even in his dreams, if he dared to have them. For in that place where punishment was not only administered through chains and commands, but through the calculated neglect of a vast, indifferent machinery, even the slightest trace of hope was often extinguished before it had the chance to flicker. I remember vividly the frozen air that greeted us each morning biting into our skin before we even left the barracks. And though I had long since stopped noticing pain in the usual sense, because cold in the Gulag was not a sensation, but a condition of being, I never forgot the sight of men whose limbs turned purple with frostbite before they finished standing in line for the morning count. A count that had to be exact, even if one of us had collapsed the night before and been dragged off into the dark unreported. The barracks, if one could even call them that, were more accurately described as wooden coffins stacked end to end, the planks warped with damp and time. And within those narrow spaces we slept, if sleep could be found, pressed shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the fetid breath of hundreds of men who had not bathed in weeks, whose lice-ridden clothing had become second skins, whose coughs punctuated the darkness like warnings of what tomorrow would bring. Disease, of course, was a constant companion, but hunger was the master. It ruled everything from our dreams to our loyalties. And I saw men trade their last shred of dignity for an extra ration of bread, which was not bread in any real sense, but a gray, moldy slab that crumbled like sawdust in the hand and vanished too quickly when brought to the mouth. But even that was life to us, because those who couldn't meet their quotas were given less, and less meant death. Not immediately, perhaps, but inevitably, like a train. You could hear long before it arrived, howling over the tundra, We called it Trudeauden the Workday Unit, and it determined our fate with mathematical cruelty, for every gram of bread was tied to a number scrawled beside our names. And if we failed to move enough timber, haul enough coal, or dig enough earth, our rations would shrink, our bodies would weaken, and eventually we would join the weak brigade. The OKP, a euphemism so dark, it bordered on the grotesque cultural assistance section, where rations were slashed. Further work was no lighter, and the road ended in a shallow grave dug by another dying man. By mid-morning, we would already be at the worksite, having marched through snow so deep it devoured the legs of the smaller men. And we'd begin the day's toil with tools so primitive, it seemed the state had dug them from the last century. Wooden shovels, rusted picks, hands wrapped in rags, because gloves were a fantasy reserved for guards, and always, always the cold so deep that it turned sweat to ice and pain to numbness, a mercy perhaps, but also a danger, because when you could no longer feel your feet, it meant they might no longer be yours. In the Colima mines where I was sent for, a time the ground was frozen year-round, and our task was to chip away at it. As if the sun had never existed, some men collapsed from exhaustion before noon. Others faked injuries or tried to sabotage their quotas, hoping for lighter assignments. But more often than not, they were dragged to the punishment cells or simply left behind, their bodies retrieved later if the wolves hadn't gotten to them first. And at night, when we returned, our clothes soaked with sweat now frozen to our backs, we were herded back into the barracks where heat was a rumor, and sleep a battle fought against the lice, the coughing, the moaning of men too weak to rise from their bunks, but too afraid to die quietly. And if you found a spot to lie down, you prayed that no one next to you would vomit, or bleed, or die, because the stench would be with you for hours. And if the guards were in a foul mood, they might search the room at midnight, smashing through what few belongings we had, dragging someone out for questioning, or for sport. What passed for hygiene was laughable. In my entire first winter, I washed once in a bathhouse so overcrowded that we were allotted 5 minutes each, scrubbing at our skin with cracked bars of soap that smelled like diesel. And when I returned to my barracks still wet, the cold turned my hair to ice and my skin to stone. Some men tried to melt snow to wash, but the guards frowned upon that too, claiming it encouraged softness, and so we learned to live with filth as another layer of skin. There were days, rare ones, when illness confined me to the infirmary, not that it offered much relief, as the so-called doctors were often prisoners themselves, untrained, unsupplied, overwhelmed. And I remember lying there once watching a man across from me who had lost all his teeth to scurvy, trying to suck soup through broken lips. And I thought, this is what life means now, to cling to one more spoonful, one more breath, even if your body has already surrendered. The guards, of course, were not all the same. Some were indifferent, others malicious, but all were part of the system, and some seemed to take a sick delight in devising new ways to torment us. Sleep deprivation, extended roll calls in sub-zero blizzards, punishment for offenses as small as possessing a pencil or humming a forbidden song. And worst of all, the kartse, a tiny cell dug into the ground where the cold was eternal and the darkness complete, where time ceased to matter, and your only companion was the sound of your own breathing growing fainter by the hour. I survived somehow, not because I was stronger than the rest, but because I learned to forget, to let go of everything that tied me to the world outside my name, my past, even my dreams. And in that forgetting, I found a strange kind of endurance, not hope, because hope was dangerous, but something like the dull refusal to die, a stubborn ember that burned just hot enough to keep the frost from claiming me entirely.